Tonight we're going to be servicing my Marzocchi EXR Pro forks. And these are a really basic old school Marzocchi coil fork, and a lot of early Marzoccis are assembled in a similar way. So the strip down and rebuild of this fork can be, the process can be applied to various other forks. It's going to break down into two parts, which is essentially going to become a lower leg service and then a service of the push rods and the coils. Now this is an open bath fork, so the oil that is both lubricating the bushings and is essentially the lower leg oil is also the oil that flows through the push rods, creating our compression dampening. So we're going to do this in two parts, and we're going to be essentially breaking it down, because the lower leg service can, the basic principles of that can be applied to other types of fork that aren't necessarily open bath in design as well. Before you start any fork service, it's really important you've got all the oils, fluids and the volumes of those oils and fluids you need to complete the service. If you put an incorrect amount of oil into a fork, it may not perform as well as it can, and worst case scenario, you can damage irreparably the internals of those forks. Also, in some situations, by changing the fluid levels or the weight of the volume of the oil, you can change the performance characteristics of that fork. For example, with older Marzoccis, if you put in a lighter oil, you will speed up the rebound. Conversely, a heavier oil, slowing it down. And that's not just the rebound, that will affect the whole compression for the full stroke of the fork and change the character of it dramatically. So, what are all the tools and things we need to perform this fork service?
A socket set, suspension oil, suspension grease, a measuring jug, isopropyl alcohol, and lint-free cleaning cloths.
Start off by cleaning the whole fork down, making sure there's no dirt or grit, especially in the seals, as you don't want any of that working its way into the internals when we start to strip everything down. At this stage, just a regular bike cleaner will be absolutely fine, but just make sure that you get those seals absolutely immaculately clean. We have foot nuts at the bottom of the lowers. These are holding the push rods to the lowers, connecting the top and bottom parts of the fork together. Releasing these will allow us to drop the lowers off, which will also release the oil in the lower leg oil baths. Now when we drop these lowers off, that oil is going to come pouring out, so you need something to catch that oil. So make sure you've got a bucket or something similar where we can collect all that oil, and make sure that afterwards you dispose of that oil in a responsible fashion. Don't just throw it in the river down your drain. Now with some old Marzocchi forks and older coil forks, the way to drain the oil is to remove the top caps, take out the coils, fully compress the fork and drain the oil out that way. Most modern forks, including air forks, remove the foot nuts first and drain the oil out the bottom lowers of the legs. Now if we take the coils out and we try and undo the foot nut, the push rod will want to rotate with inside the stanchion. If we don't take that coil out, we'll be able to undo these foot nuts without the need of a special tool to insert into the stanchion to hold the push rod static. So just make sure again you've got a bucket to catch that falling oil. So I'll just measure that. There's that oil wanting to drain out already. So just let that oil drain out and make sure there's absolutely nothing left in there. The oil's coming through pretty clear. I'm not seeing any silvering or any metallic flakes floating around in there, which would be a sign of damage internally. This is a good thing. The clearer that and cleaner that oil is, the better it is. If it's all dirty and mucky, then the service is well overdue. Now let's just drop that all the way off. Working it easily. so as to not damage the seals. Drop the push rods through, and that is us. With our lowers separated, I'm going to stuff a little bit of blue roll into those legs to catch any residual oil to stop it draining through. I'm going to be putting all kinds of cleaning products in here. I'm going to be cleaning it out with isopropanol, but I'm going to give it a quick blast of GT85 just to loosen up anything in there to help it flow out the bottom. Now, if this was a lower service, the next step would be to clean everything down, stanchions and inside the lowers, replace the seals if they were needing replaced, and then reassemble, inject fresh oil into the holes that the push rods go through, and then torque everything back up. Because we're going to open up the upper part of the fork and service the push rods as well, we now want to remove the top caps that are holding the springs and compression, take the coils out, and then bring the push rods up through the top of the fork. Now, when removing the top cap from any fork, you're going to end up using quite a large socket. Now, the top caps, whether they're coil or air, tend to have a bit of a bevel on them and are quite shallow. To make a positive connection, it can be advised that you grind down the surface of the socket so it's flat, because there'll be a slight chamfer and bevel on that as well. That flat surface will index better on the top cap and prevent rounding that off, which will ultimately destroy the top cap. And even if you round it off a little and you get it off, you're damaging the fork, and you don't want to do that. So. There we go, so that's the preload. So push that push rod through, we'll get a washer and the coil. Now, quite often when removing the push rods from any fork, at the bottom of the stanchion, there's going to be either a smelly ring, and you want to get a pick and lift that out, or you're going to need to get a pair of needle nose pliers to get in there and remove it. Remove a lock ring, which is what we've got here. There we go. Be very careful with this because you don't want to slip and scratch and damage your stanchions. You also don't want it to ping off and go in your eye. So, now we're able to drop out my full push rod assembly to drop into my nice bucket of oil. Nice. Now at this stage, reconstructing the uppers of the fork is going to be different from model to model. So refer to the manufacturer's service manual. You'll find these online. You may have to do a bit of digging, but look about some of the forums and you'll find the original service manual. In there you'll find exploded diagrams showing how all those parts you've just stripped and cleaned go back together. So always keep a handle of the order of play, otherwise you may end up assembling your fork in an incorrect order, thus damaging the fork.
Once everything is disassembled, clean and degrease all the components using the isopropanol. Use isopropanol to clean the stanchions externally and internally using a plastic rod or wooden dowel to push the cloth into the stanchions, making sure that you aren't able to scratch any of the internals. I've used a piece of plastic conduit as it's flexible and won't be able to scratch the internals of either the stanchions or the lowers. Repeat the process of the lowers, ensuring that all of the internal space is cleaned thoroughly and that there's no old oil within the fork. Ensure that there's no oil residue on the outside of the lowers before proceeding. When placing the push rods back into the fork, ensure that they go in the correct order and be careful not to scratch any of the stanchion. Take special care when placing any lock rings into the stanchion that they don't jump out and scratch the stanchion, or worse, hit you in the eye.
It's now time to put in the main coils in both sides, put the lowers back on, add our oil and torque everything up. So both sides on this fork are identical, so I'm just going to do the one to show you. So we're going to take our coil, drops in, on top of that we have the washer and then the preload. Again, it's just the reverse process of this assembly. Now I'm putting the coil in first so that I have a little bit of tension to stop that push rod from to rotate when I put the foot nuts on. We're now going to place our lowers and uppers together for adding our oil to the bottom. At this stage it's becoming like a conventional lower service. So how do we go about bringing these two parts together? Well, for a start, we need to make sure that we don't damage the seals. So to help us, I'm going to put a fair, even coat of suspension specific grease around the seals and around the bottom of the stanchions. I'm also going to use some cable ties to help open up the seals a little bit so I can pull them out without damaging the seals afterwards. A few different suspension greases we can use. I'm using RSP Slick Kick. Stendek do a good one as well. So don't be shy. And also around the bottom of the stanchion as well. This will help the two glide seamlessly together. Now the cable tie trick, because you want to be able to get the seals past the stanchions without hurting the seals, and you're trying to do both at the same time. Sometimes it can work getting one and then getting the other, but what can sometimes help you is putting a cable tie in on one side or the other. You can do it in both, because you can always then pull that out afterwards, like so. So that's our two halves together. It's just a simple case of bringing those through so that the foot nuts are exposed on the bottom there. Beautiful. Now at this stage, you would put the fork, the foot nuts not all the way in, so that they're not seated all the way out. You'd put the fork at an angle and you would inject your oil to the correct volumes into the lowers. And that lower oil bath would lubricate the bushings, thus preventing stanchion wear and keeping your fork running smooth. Because this is an open bath design, it's taking quite a lot of oil on both sides, 125 ml in this particular case. So I'm going to get these foot nuts in, tighten them up, as the push rods aren't going to rotate because the coils are holding them in tension. Pop the top caps off again, pour my oil in, top caps back on, and that's us good to go. So, take the top caps off and get ready to pour in some oil. Your air escaping there as it bubbles through. Just going to cycle the compression there just to make sure that oil is made it all the way to the bottom. Get our washers and top caps back in. And at this stage, I'm going to run a little bit of grease around our top caps just to make sure they don't seize. Funny story, these particular forks actually came out of a hole. They were in a fly coop at the back of a farm. There was an old Norco hardtail. The frame was alright, the majority of the components were rusted to fuck. And there's this pair of Marzocchi forks on the front. I was like, yeah, but Marzocchi seals, they're going to be legal tender after the nuclear bombs fall because they're the only things that are going to survive. So, that is our EXR Pro oil change. So there's going to be some grease on the stanchions because we use that to help get everything together. So you're going to want to clean it down again, make sure there's nothing I don't want. And I can fit them back in the bike. Job done.